Hi, Mark Follensby from Romania. This is an introduction to worm composting. This presentation will cover everything you need for vermiculture, from getting your worms, to making your bin, to collecting vermicompost, and then using it. What are the 4 things you need for vermicomposting? Worms, wouldn't be vermiculture without worms. A bin to store them in, bedding, and food scraps to feed the worms. As far as the worms go, I recommend red wigglers, the Icinia fetidia worm. They're afraid of light. They tolerate a high proportion of food in the soil. They eat a lot of food. They also eat a wide variety of food. I'll discuss the worms more later. As far as worm bins go, worms like a dark, moist like a wet sponge, quiet area. And by quiet, I mean free from vibrations. I generally recommend an 18 to 20 gallon storage tote. Too small, and the worms have nowhere to go if the conditions become unfavorable. Too big, and the worm bin can be very heavy when full. Bedding, really any shredded organic material can be used for bedding. I generally recommend dry shredded newspaper. You can also use cardboard, peat, and cocoa coir. Food scraps. Generally, the food that goes in your worm bin is the same as that would go in your outdoor compost pile, and the rules are generally similar. No meat, no bones, no dairy, no oil, no metal items or plastic, things that don't break down. What do your worms eat? Red wigglers, as I mentioned earlier, eat a wide variety of food. They generally eat cores, vegetable scraps, rinds, peels, husks, cardboard, newspaper, breads and cereals, coffee grounds, tea bags, including the filters, and eggshells. Eggshells become grit for them. You should avoid putting the following things in your worm bin: meat, fish, bones, dairy, grease, vegetable oil, pet waste, salt, dirt from outside, and plastic. All these things can be problematic in your bin. Meat and dairy have to putrefy before the worms can eat them. Remember, worms don't have teeth, so they eat the rot that's on the food. In the case of protein, that means that it has to putrefy first, and that can lead to really bad smells in your bin. Grease and vegetable oil should be avoided because those will, in time, smother your worms because your worms breathe through their skin. Pet waste should be avoided because you'll bring pathogens into your worm bin that can harm you, doesn't hurt your worms. Salt should be avoided. By salt, I mean salt that's on the food. Salt that's in the food is okay, but if there's visible salt that you can see, that can be problematic. Also, dirt from outside, that can harbor insect eggs, that can lead to insects in your bin. And plastic is just anything that doesn't break down. So, let's talk about the red wiggler worm. Again, they're otherwise known as Icinia fetidia. Common names are red worm, red wiggler, tiger worm, or manure worm. I found that they're really well suited for the indoor composting environment. They tolerate a wide range of temperatures. Between 40 and 90 degrees is their survival range, ideally 65 to 75 degrees. It's the same temperature range that we're generally comfortable is where they're comfortable. We're talking about soil temperature in the case of worms, so your worm bin is much more thermally stable than if we were talking about air temperatures. They're afraid of the light, so they generally won't escape. They consume food at a relatively good rate. They're tolerant of mixing and handling, and they eat a wide range of food types. The reproduction rate under ideal conditions is 10 to 12 weeks. And by ideal conditions, I mean sufficient space, soil temperature, again, between 65 and 75 degrees Fahrenheit, and there's ample food. Worms eat about half their body weight in our food per week. The picture here shows worm cocoons. Those are 4 little cocoons. You can see how small they are for scale. They look like little onions. Making a worm bin is simple. Again, they need something that's opaque and can tolerate being moist and provides enough space for them to multiply. As you can see here, what I generally recommend is a simple 18 to 20 gallon storage tote with some holes drilled in the top and some simple screening. Really simple to make one. You generally have everything you need to make a worm bin already at your house. You don't need to spend a lot of money online to buy one. So how do you start your bin? You buy a pound of worms as shown in the left photo there. That's the white container. Get some food. You've got your bin. How do you begin? Really simple. Gather all the things you need. Get your worm bin, some newspaper, your instructions, and your worms and the food. Put the food in the very bottom of one corner. Cover that with your worms. Then shred up that newspaper so you have a nice 2 to 3 inch layer of dry shredded newspaper. Again, you can also use peat moss or cocoa coir, whatever you happen to have around. And as you can see in the middle photo, I'm kind of pressing it down so it has good contact with that soil, and it'll wick out any additional water. Put the top on, take it downstairs, and you're off to the races. So how do you feed your worms? Really simple. Using, as shown on the right-hand side of the slide, a half-gallon bucket. And every week you need to feed your worms half of that half-gallon bucket, so about a quarter gallon, so about a quart of food. That's every week the first 4 weeks. So the process is simple. Get a quart of food week number 1 when you first put your worms in. That's what was shown in the previous slide. Food in the bottom, worms on top, dry shredded newspaper to cover. Next week, that same thing. A quart of food in the bottom of one of the corners that's adjacent to corner number 1. Move the newspaper out of the way, put the food in the bottom, push some of the worms over, and replace the newspaper. Week 3, same thing. A quart in that bottom corner, cover with worms, newspaper. Week 4, the same. When you return to your original corner, it's now week number 5, you increase that by 50%, so 1.5 quarts in that corner number 5. That same amount week 6, week 7, week 8. When you return to that original corner, it's now week 9, you now double the amount of food you're putting in. So you're putting in 2 quarts. That's because, as I mentioned in the previous slide, your worms reproduce and multiply when there's sufficient space, food, and your worms are at a happy temperature. In a brand new bin, where you're feeding them and keeping them in your nice warm house, all lights are green, and your original pound of worms should now be close to 2 pounds. Whereas your first pound of worms can eat half a pound of food, 2 pounds of worms can eat an entire pound of food. And you keep that process going, always increasing by that ratio. That will prevent problems in your worm bin. So, you've had your worm bin a while. It's been 6 months to a year, and it's time to harvest the vermicompost. Generally, you should harvest the vermicompost at least annually, and you should always harvest it when it becomes more than 6 to 8 inches deep. When it becomes deeper than that, the worms won't dive all the way into the bottom, and it can become anaerobic. Harvesting is simple. On a nice warm day when it's above 65 degrees outside, a nice bright sun, take your worm bin outside, open up a tarp or garbage bag, flip it over, knock all the worms off, and make a little pyramid out of the soil. Any of the worms that are on the surface, they're exposed to the sun, will dive into the soil to flee. And you just scrape off a very thin layer of soil, a half to a quarter inch, and you'll expose more worms and they'll dive in, and just keep that process up until you get to the very bottom. Take any worms, those guys go back in the bin, feed them, and you can use the soil. Here I'm taking the soil and I'm sieving it through a quarter-inch hardware cloth to get any big pieces of food and put back into the bin. Harvesting is really simple. It takes about an hour to 90 minutes for an 18-gallon storage tote, and you should get between 12 and 15 gallons, depending upon how full it is. So, what do you do with the vermicompost? Really simple. You can make tea or other things, but remember, it was never hot composted, so those seeds are still potentially viable, oftentimes tomato seeds or maybe squash. What you can do to prevent those things growing where you don't want them is to make tea, where you take the vermicompost, about a pound, and place it in a sock or a bag, and then put that sock or bag full of vermicompost in a 5-gallon bucket. And once it's the color of weak tea, you can use that, dilute that 5 gallons to make 10. You can water your plants with it, and all those seeds are stuck in the bag. You can also, alternatively, instead of having to stir that once in a while, you can also just put an aquarium stone in there or a fish bubbler, and that'll bubble away and gently mix in the same process. 1 pound of vermicompost, 5 gallons of water, put the bubbler in, wait 12 hours to overnight, and then you can use it. Again, diluting it 5 gallons into 10. So let's review and discuss some tips for success. Red wiggler worms thrive on fruit and vegetable waste, scraps, peelings, husks, cores, and rinds. They need a little bit of bedding to absorb the excess moisture, and you should avoid any meat, oils, dairy, bones, things like that. You should always bury the food in the corners and feed corners each week. That way, if you put something in one of the corners the worms don't like, for example, citrus or onions, once they break down, the worms like them, but when they're fresh, they don't. They can move out of that area without having to leave the bin. Worms also need bedding to absorb excess moisture. Shredded newspaper is a great way to manage moisture. Bugs. I recommend you don't bring in anything from outdoors. No leaves, no soil from outside. All you're putting in your worm bin, food waste and bedding like dry shredded newspaper. Soil can harbor insect eggs and larvae, and you don't want those in your bin. Once you've put them in your bin, it's hard to get them back out. Also, remember to bury your food, so it's always food in the bottom, worms on top, dry shredded newspaper. If you're concerned about fruit flies in your kitchen, make sure your food collection container has a tight-fitting lid and keep that closed. Also, keep the worm bin in an area where they will not be disturbed. Worms like dark, quiet areas with generally stable temperatures. Again, they survive between 40 and 90 degrees, and they thrive at 65 to 75 degrees. Basements or cellars or closets are really ideal. Your senses are your best guide for maintaining your worm bin. If it looks very wet, you need to dry it out by adding more bedding. If it starts to smell, probably overfeeding them, or there might be some piece of food in there that's rotting before they can eat it, like a piece of meat or some dairy. So, frequent questions. These are questions I get all the time that if I answer them now, it'll probably keep all of you on the right path. So, a concern. Does it attract bugs? Does it smell? No, it does not attract bugs, and no, it does not generally smell. If you cover the newly added food with bedding and don't add too much food at any one time, and keep your worm bin from getting too wet by adding additional newspaper whenever you feed, your worm bin will neither smell nor attract bugs. Remember, the worms aren't eating the food itself, they're eating the rot that's on the food. And as long as you don't overfeed them by using my corner process where you feed in corners and every 4 weeks increase it by 50%, the worms will reproduce and multiply and keep up with how much food you're adding, and it won't lead to any off smells. Will my worms get loose? No, your worms are happy in the bin, and they won't escape if you use a bin with screens, and follow the do's and don'ts. If it doesn't become too wet, they'll stay in there, and if you don't starve them, they'll stay in there. They're happy in the bin, and it's really where they want to be. Can I use worms for my yard? Here in Maine, the answer is generally no. The worms found in residential yards, like night crawlers and field worms, require different conditions. And if you want to learn about those worms, I recommend you seek advice from a professional, someone who's an expert. And my expertise is really in red wigglers. How do you prevent a fruit fly problem? Well, the most important thing is to make sure your compost scraps in your kitchen are covered with something with a tight-fitting lid. Secondly, bury all your food at the very bottom of your worm bin and keep the bedding layer, that's the dry shredded newspaper, at least 3 inches deep. If you already have a worm bin and you already have fruit flies, check out my FAQ on how to prevent a fruit fly problem. And what do you do with the worm compost? Again, it's great fertilizer both indoors and out. You just have to be cautious to remember that there are viable seeds in there. I always recommend making vermicompost tea. More information can be found on my website, wormmania.com. My website has free information, instructions to make your own bin, more details about separating your castings, making vermicompost tea, as well as other experiments and other crazy things I've done with worms over the years. You can check out my blog, and you can also contact me to purchase worms. I sell red wigglers, $25 a pound bed run, as well as the worm bins that were shown in the slides for $20. Together, a pound of worms in a bin for $40. And if you have any questions, you can reach out to me at wormmania@gmail.com. Thank you so much for your attention.